Howdy, gang, and welcome once again to the Duct Tape Studios. I'm Jeff McAleer, your host here at the Gaming Gang channel. Thanks for joining me once again. Before I jump into today's review, I do want to mention if you enjoy the Gaming Gang and would like to support the outlet, you can do so in a few ways. First, by utilizing our affiliate links to the One Bookshelf sites, such as DriveThruRPG. And to do so, just visit gaminggang.com, click on one of our banner ads. That way, if you happen to make a purchase, I get a small portion of that sale. And of course, you can make a one-time donation by way of PayPal or become a monthly member of our Patreon. You'll find links in the show notes. Also, down in those show notes, you'll find an invite link to our Discord server. It is absolutely free to join, so be sure to hang with the gang over on Discord. It is October, so I wanted to share some reviews of spooky games. So today I'll be sharing my thoughts on the Magnus Archives from Rusty Quill and Monte Cook Games. This is written by Monte Cook, and the 384-page hardcover carries an MSRP of $74.99. If you want to grab the PDF, you can do so over at DriveThruRPG for $24.99. Having said all that, let's swing on over to the other camera, because here I've got the Magnus Archives. A few things to mention before we get stuck in. First of all, my friends over at Monte Cook Games were kind enough to provide me with this review copy, but neither I nor anyone else affiliated with the Gaming Gang has received any other sort of compensation for me to share this review with you. It's important to know that we're also not going to look at each and every page of the book, but I do want to give you a good feel for what you're going to find inside. Then, of course, a couple of short adventures wrap up this volume, or in the case of the Magnus Archives, they're known as statements. So if you're a player and your game master has picked this up, maybe they just haven't started running it yet, maybe they're talking about picking this up. Please keep in mind, even though I'm going to stay relatively spoiler-free, you might see some things which ruin the surprises of these statements. So you have been warned. Of course, if your game master is kicking around buying the Magnus Archives, by all means, let them know about this review. That way they can approach this and make a far more informed buying decision. First thing we're going to do is take a look at the credits. A lot of folks worked very hard to bring this to life. So let's give credit where credit is due. If you are not familiar with the Magnus Archives, it was a horror podcast which ran for quite some time and quite a few episodes and was very, very popular. And this is based upon those podcasts. Now, I do want to point out right off the bat, if you have not listened to the Magnus Archives and you're a game master picking this up, once you've read through this, it is going to have tons and tons of spoilers for the podcast. Now, on the flip side of that, does that mean that you have to be intimately familiar with the Magnus Archives as a game master or even as a player in order to enjoy this role-playing game? Absolutely not. I have listened to about 3 or 4 episodes of the Magnus Archives. It is a very cool concept. It has got some really bizarre stories going on. And I read through this and now it's like, oh, okay. So I know what happens. Because even though the Magnus Archives podcast is episodic and you are looking at the statements are essentially standalone, there is an overall arc to the podcast and really interesting conclusion as well. Now, there have been some spin-offs from the Magnus Archives. Those are not tackled in this book. Now, this is built upon the Cypher System from Monte Cook Games. And I want to also mention everything you need is in this book. So if you're familiar with Monte Cook Games, you know that they've got a lot of genre books for the Cypher System. And of course, with those genre books, you need to have the core rule book to use them. That is not the case here. This is all self-contained. This is all you need. Now, if you are running Cypher System, or maybe as a player, you've played some Cypher System, it'll be very easy for you to just slide right on into the Magnus Archives. Although there are some major changes to the mechanics Cypher System. I'll talk about that in just a bit. But as far as the action resolution mechanics, they remain the same. So if you're not familiar with Cypher System, the core mechanic's pretty easy. As a game master, you're going to set the difficulty tier of something from 1 to 10, and then you multiply that by 3. And that is the number that needs to be rolled equal to or higher than on a 20-sided die in order to succeed at what you're attempting to do. Now, there is also still the game master not rolling dice aspect, which I actually like because kind of takes some of the onus off of the game master. You know, sometimes players out there, especially if it's game master who rolls their dice in front of the players, are like, oh, look at that die roll. Oh, it's all the GM's fault that we got the TPK. You won't encounter that. The players roll all of the dice. Now, does that mean a game master can't roll any dice? No, of course not. But the players actually will roll the dice for both what they're looking to try to do as well as the adversaries that they may face. We do have our 4 types of characters here. We've got the investigator, we've got the protector, we've got the elocutionist, as well as the occultist. And each of these is going to serve a role in the group. So very similar to the types that we have in Cypher System. We still have might, speed, and intellect pools, which are spent by the players in order to activate their special abilities, as well as use effort to make things easier. We also have the edge as well to make the point purchase cheaper for certain aspects. So if you have a might edge of 1, that means whenever you're spending from your might pool, it's going to cost you 1 point less than other players will pay. So that still carries over. So like I said, very easy to kind of segue from Cypher System into the Magnus Archives. We do have the descriptors as well as the foci. So as with Cypher System, we've got the adjective, noun, verb layout of the player characters. We have loads of different special abilities that each of the types can get from the various different tiers. So character advancement is by tier. We do have the 6 tiers as we see in Cypher System, and quite a few different abilities within those tiers that the player characters can acquire. I will say the Magnus Archives is set in our modern day world. So the player characters are just regular people. Well, at least to start off, they are. So you will find that there's more of a focus on skills than there are special abilities. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have magic and the ability for player characters to utilize magic. Yes, this is a game of horror and the supernatural, the occult, and so forth. So, of course, they are going to have access to that, keeping in mind it may have a dire cost in order to utilize that. One of the big selling points of Cypher System is the fact players can really custom craft the sort of player character they want to play at your game table. And that is still the case with the Magnus Archives. In fact, I got to say, it feels like there's actually more customization options in the Magnus Archives than in the core rulebook for Cypher System. I thought that was pretty wild. Now, the first half of the book is going to be devoted to the rules of the game, creating characters, equipment, how do you play, and so forth. And then the second half is going to be aimed at the game master. So as far as the Magnus Archives podcast, the Magnus Archives is this organization which logs occurrences of the supernatural and the weird and the occult. One of the cool aspects of the Magnus Archives is that it's horror, but we're not looking at your traditional werewolves and zombies and vampires. No, these things are really weird, really creepy. And the podcast itself is really, really unique. That's why it was so popular. You also have the angle of cosmic horror. And one of the cool things about the Magnus Archives is it is not the Cthulhu mythos. So players out there who are used to a lot of horror role-playing games aren't going to be sitting there going, oh, ho-hum, it's a Migo or it's a deep one. Well, we know what we need to do here. No, all these things are just weird and different and unusual. As far as the production quality, it's what I've come to expect from Monte Cook Games. Really cool artwork. Nice paper stock, nice thick paper stock. This also has a stitched binding, so this will hold up very well at your game table, even though this is clocking in at nearly 400 pages. Let's talk a little bit about some of the changes that have been made to the core Cypher System mechanics. And I think the biggest thing we've got here, and it's actually carrying over to the new edition of Cypher, which just successfully crowdfunded by quite a lot. And it is the separation of your pools of points from your health. So as it goes currently in Cypher System, you have pools of points for might, speed, and intellect. And the players spend those points in order to do different things. So you might have, say, a 14 in might. That doesn't mean that you've got a strength score of 14 on a scale of 3 to 18. No, it means you have 14 points, which can be spent on activating special abilities, as well as utilizing effort to make might-related actions easier for you to be successful at. But as you took damage in Cypher System, you would actually lose points from those pools. And if the damage wasn't marked as a certain type, such as intellect or speed, the loss would come first from might, then from speed, and then from your intellect. And as you would lose points in one of your pools, if you had 0, that would actually move you along on the damage track. Now, we still have a damage track, but it is utilized a little bit differently. So what we do now is we will actually have harm affecting the player. And because this is a modern era role-playing game and the player characters are just regular folk, you'll find combat in the Magnus Archives has a much higher level of lethality than you would find in Cypher System. And the way it's laid out, and it's even mentioned in the book, if a person were attacked by a madman with an axe and they were hit with that axe, well, at best, they're going to the hospital. At worst, they're taking a dirt nap. And that makes absolute complete sense. We also have stress. So as the player characters are going to be exposed to various supernatural elements, maybe they see a ghost or see a monster or something else affects them, they're going to find that their stress level will increase. It's going to start at 0 and increase from there. Stress makes things more difficult for you to achieve. Although, here's an interesting twist. Players can spend stress if they're being proactive to do something. It's almost like a manic energy that they've got. They can actually spend stress to improve their chances of doing something. Now, it cannot be utilized on the defensive or for anything other than the player character being proactive, trying to do something. But I thought that was kind of cool. Now you can relieve stress. you can decrease your stress by spending 3 hours in a relatively safe location, spending time with your friends, or maybe a pet. There are a lot of different ways for the player characters to relieve stress. Also, should mention that as far as the player characters themselves, there is far more focus on skills than on special abilities. And of course, that makes sense because the player characters are regular folk to start off with. As far as the second half of the book, we are looking at this with a focus on the game master. So we are going to get far more information about the world of the Magnus Archives, what takes place over the series itself. We get to learn about avatars and such. We find out, how does the Magnus Archives podcast conclude? What happens at the end? And like I said, really, really cool stuff. But of course, if you read this and you're not all the way through the Magnus Archives, well, yeah, there's loads and loads of spoilers. As with pretty much everything I have seen from Monte Cook Games to this point, and it's not been a ton. It's been fairly recently that I've been able to get on board with Monte Cook Games. The Game Master advice and the tips on how to run the Magnus Archives is excellent. That's one of the highlights that I have found so far with Monte Cook Games releases, is just the really great inspirational information and tips and tricks for really having the best game possible is included in the Game Master sections of their books. And I think that's very, very cool. As you can see, we've got quite an extensive bestiary with various different creatures. Now, remember I mentioned, well, we're not talking about the typical werewolves, zombies, vampires sort of horror. I didn't necessarily say that they don't exist in the Magnus Archives. They just are different than what you would expect. Of course, because this is built on the Cypher system, we do have the various different ciphers. We have the artifacts and books, which play a very, very big role in the podcast. We get some information here about running the game as your game master. And as I pointed out, we're going to wrap up with a couple of short adventures. Once again, they're known as statements. And I got to say, they're pretty cool. Another thing about the Magnus Archives that's a little bit different is, as far as these statements, sure, as a game master, if you want to create your own statements, fantastic, not a problem. But it is recommended that the game master actually create the statements that the investigators are going to check out with the players. So the players will have far more say in the sorts of adventures that they take part in. I also like how we've got a pretty extensive example of play and the two adventures, which actually provides us with a couple of really nice examples of how a statement would be constructed. Now, of course, it is important for you to keep in mind adventures that are driven by Cypher System are more narrative in their approaches. So it may not be very unusual for the player characters to go off and investigate these statements and have no combat take place, because this is really a game of horror and discovery and mysteries and investigation. So those looking for a pulpy, two-fisted action sort of horror role-playing game are going to be disappointed. So we're going to wrap up with some information about creating the statements. We got our statement sheet here, as well as our character sheets. That is a peek inside the Magnus Archives role-playing game from Rusty Quill and Monte Cook Games. Let's swing on over to the other camera so I can share some final thoughts as well as my review score. I have to say, I'm very impressed by the Magnus Archives. As someone who only listened to a few episodes of the podcast and liked what I heard, and I could certainly see why the podcast was as popular as it was when it was airing, it really does come across that Monte Cook Games, with the help of Rusty Quill, have taken a ton of things from the podcast that made it different and unique and incorporated it into this role-playing game. So very nicely done. Once again, I am not an expert by any stretch of the imagination with the podcast itself. I like the new addition of the stress mechanic. I think that's very cool. I like how players can actually spend stress to improve their chances of doing something in certain situations. Otherwise, as they accrue stress, it makes things more difficult for them to achieve. The fact that we have the pools separated from damage is a big deal. This is something that we are seeing incorporated into the upcoming Cypher. I don't know if it's exactly the same as we see here. I would think probably not. I think the lethality is going to be lowered a little bit as far as the recently crowdfunded Cypher. But I do like the fact that we no longer have damage coming from those attribute pools, because a lot of players out there didn't like the fact that as they spent points from their pool, it made them far more susceptible to taking damage on the damage track. And I certainly understand how people weren't liking the whole resource management angle of that. Although, as far as role-playing games go, there's a lot of resource management that might not be obvious to the naked eye. But like I said, I could certainly understand where people were coming from. I like the fact that combat is very lethal in the Magnus Archive. Once again, as it's pointed out in the book, you get hit by an axe from a madman, you're not just shaking that off. You might be shaking off an arm, but you're not shaking off being hit by an axe. Now, I will point out, if you are not a fan of the core action resolution mechanic for Cypher System, this isn't going to change your mind, because the core mechanic is still essentially the same. If you're not a fan of the adjective, noun, verb aspect of your player character, this is not going to change your mind about Cypher System. And of course, if you're looking for a two-fisted, action-packed tale of horror and suspense, Magnus Archives probably isn't going to be your sort of role-playing game either. Although, I gotta say, I thought this is really nicely done. I think this is a very cool role-playing game. I would get a kick out of playing in it. I would certainly enjoy running it as well. And really, at the end of the day, when I review role-playing games, that is my main criteria. Would I enjoy playing in this role-playing game? Would I enjoy running this role-playing game? I will also point out that as a player, it does feel as if there are some additional levels of complexity compared to Cypher System. So newcomers to the game as a player might feel a little overwhelmed with a lot of the different things going on, because you've got the stress, and you've got the damage track, and you've got your attribute pools, and you're spending those points, and you've got abilities, and you've got skills, and the effort that you can utilize. You've got edges. It could become kind of confusing for newcomers. So please keep that in mind. But all in all, I think this is a cool role-playing game, and I, once again, would enjoy playing it and would get a kick out of running it. So on a scale of 0 to 10, I give the Magnus Archives an 8 out of 10. Pretty cool. I will probably listen to more episodes of the Magnus Archives podcast, even though I know how it ends. So very nicely done. That's it for this time out. If you like the video, by all means, please give it a quick thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And if you do subscribe, don't forget, ring that bell, because it'll not only let you know when I share videos such as this review. Ooh, scary kids, scary. It'll also let you know when my live stream, The Gaming Gang Dispatch, airs Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday evenings right here on YouTube at 7 p.m. Central. Of course, when you're not watching videos on the Gaming Gang channel, be sure to visit thegaminggang.com for all the latest in tabletop gaming news, reviews, and a whole lot more you are not going to find here on YouTube. You know the drill. Get your geek on at thegaminggang.com. Once again, I'm Jeff McAleer. Thank you very much for watching. And until I see you next time, I certainly hope all of you get to enjoy plenty of great gaming with your gang.